Hey everybody, Eric Radvon here with part 3 of my comic book inspiration series. And today we're going to take a look at a big one, an epic in the modern comic world. There we go. It's Frank Miller's Dark Knight Odyssey at this point. It started off with a mini series in 1986. And has sprawled into this multi-generational epic at this point. So let's talk about it. This is one of those stories that has been hailed as a watershed moment in comic books. It really took the notion of superhero comics to an entirely new place. So there's a lot that had been happening, right? So I think you had an independent comic book scene that had been producing some really interesting stuff, at least from the 60s, prior to that, I'm sure. But there was like this bubbling movement from the 60s and 70s. I think simultaneous to that, comic books as a whole were growing and maturing. So you had a fan base that maybe started reading in the 40s and 50s. You had another wave that kind of came on board with the Marvel explosion in the 60s. In the 70s, you have this entire Bronze Age explosion where comics like Conan the Barbarian, Howard the Duck, all these different things, Neil Adams on Batman, it brought all these different dimensions to the comic book world. You start seeing the beginnings of like comic book conventions and things. The first comic specialty stores start opening. In the early 80s, you get this, this building up of what we call the direct market, meaning like specialty shops that just sell comics, started to become a thing, versus just a purely newsstand experience. So how did all this bring about Dark Knight Returns? Frank Miller had been tearing things up on Marvel's Daredevil. He joined that book as an artist and, sort of evolved his style throughout the issues. Eventually took the reins as the writer and the artist, and then really started rocking and rolling with Daredevil. So he introduced Elektra, he introduced this ninja element to it. The artwork took on that sort of iconic Frank Miller look and feel, really bold, locations, incredible use of shadow, light, action, figures, things like that. So really amazing run on Daredevil. So, Daredevil's not it was a low-level book by anyone's measure. Became the hottest thing in comics. Inspires the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, right? If you look at the Ninja Turtles, it's like 85% Daredevil going on there. Frank Miller's Daredevil, especially in those early days, mixed with their other influences, right? So Frank Miller is just killing it across the board, and and then he's working on some stuff, and he's got this Batman story, right? So the premise is, as you're likely aware, is that it's a kind of dystopian future situation, and Batman has retired from crime fighting, and he's called back into things here at an older age than what we're used to. We're used to seeing him in a Gotham City that is, a lot more gritty than perhaps we had seen, and it's all delivered in an absolutely stunning way. Frank Miller's artwork, really evolved to a look and feel all his own, in the same way that like a master filmmaker really starts to develop their style after their first couple of features. So Dark Knight Returns is one of those things that I think, if you read about comic books, comic book history, it's going to be called like one of the most landmark moments, one of the biggest comics ever made, one of the biggest events in comics. And there's all kinds of angles and spin that I've seen on it over the years from a lot of really smart and nuanced experts out there. And it's everything ranging from this really made comics grow up. It moved comics away from being just a kid thing. It took superheroes from a camp place into this like reality-based place. All these different things that, to me, none of that is really fully accurate. So let's start with the camp thing. Batman wasn't the 1960s TV show, and then Frank Miller comes along and it's Dark Knight Returns. There was a huge evolution there. In fact, the beginnings of the character are quite similar to what Frank brings back. So the Dark Knight Returns is kind of a double meaning there, right? Because it's really that there are elements of the grittiness in those original Detective comic issues where Batman makes his debut that are, I would say, even more hardcore than what Miller presents. So first of all, that there's a rich history to the character, like all these comic characters that started, in the golden age. You go back and you read that stuff from the 30s and 40s, and it is loaded with all kinds of personality, all kinds of reflection of a world that was not squeaky clean. The image of like the square-jawed father knows best superhero is really coming from your mid 50s, right? So if you peel back the onion layer to a little bit before that, to the 30s and 40s, you're going to find a lot more of a raucous kind of storytelling, a lot more social commentary thrown in there, a lot of jabs, different political leanings one way or the other. So this sort of antiseptic kind of, under ruse selling comic book thing was much later actually than that. So let's start with that. Batman had a kind of gritty beginning. Then there was the 60s and the camp and the TV show and all that stuff. But then in the 70s, you have some tremendous Batman stories being done by Denny O'Neil, Neil Adams coming into the picture. So you get a much darker, more like crime-driven Gotham City experience happening, prior to Miller's work coming in. So I guess my point being that this is not an overnight thing. Now, what Miller did do was he just brings a master class in storytelling to this. I mean, this is a fully realized world. It's a beautiful story. I think you're pulled into it in the same way you are one of those films that you catch late at night on TV and you just can't turn it off and you end up staying up till 1 a.m. or something. To me, Dark Knight Returns has that kind of energy to it. It's gotten all these labels as grim and gritty, right? That was the whole thing. Frank Miller made comics grim and gritty. And again, I disagree. I don't feel it's grim and gritty. There are gritty aspects to it for sure. It very much reflects this sort of high crime, situation that was going on throughout the United States in the 1980s. Urban centers and the city, New York City, was a much different place than it is today, right? There was not the M&M store and all that type of stuff. In Times Square, it was a whole different situation. So there's definitely a lot of that. A lot of that sort of incredible angst of the late 20th century. I don't know what it was, but you go back, watch some movies from the 70s and 80s. Watch some news footage from the 70s and 80s. I don't know if it was like the cigarettes everybody was smoking, the toxic ingredients in that, but you think the world is crazy and off the rails today, check out, whatever, what I think 20 years ago, and obviously it's more like 40 years ago, check out 40 years ago and scan some headlines. And crime was insane across the US and the world, really. There was a lot going on. And there's all kinds of theories and stuff. There's the whole there's the whole thing as like birth control and things became more readily accessible, population changes happen. There's all these theories about it and stuff. I'm not sure we have a holistic answer, but you look back on that time from our vantage point now, and it's incredible how rough around the edges it really was. And especially you look at, American cities all across the eastern seaboard, they were feeling old, they were feeling beat up, they were feeling dangerous. So this world that Miller presents in Gotham reflects that. You've got everything taken just like a notch higher than probably the headlines he was seeing in his New York newspapers as he was putting this together. So yeah, I mean, there's crime aspects, there's unsettling aspects, you've got unsavory mutant gangs, and this just kind of feeling of wasted human life and all of that. But again, that's just the surface level. That's the painting on the wall. But what's going on inside the heart and soul of these characters? The feeling of Bruce Wayne, he's got that tough guy Clint Eastwood Hemingway thing going on. It's like short utterances and all of that stuff. But throughout all of that, you still have this real like somber and touching narrative that Miller's bringing through, and it was a voice of a guy who's kind of been through so much, right? And it's funny because what was Miller when he did this was like in his 20s, maybe 30s maximum, I think. So, he's not some super old guy, but he really channels this like somberness of like a middle-aged kind of story and reflection of it. It's like it's almost like Bruce Wayne is sort of like a Prospero kind of character. He's been through some stuff, and we're getting him at his end here, and so he's got some baggage. He's got some, he obviously left, and it's just a really interesting take on Bruce Wayne. I think there was a lot of things that moved Bruce Wayne in different directions, but if you picked up an average Batman comic, you would see stuff like him in a like a Hugh Hefner kind of ensemble in Wayne Manor with like an ascot and stuff, and it was like a little stodgy. And believe it or not, that kind of take even persisted well into the 90s in terms of that kind of like just default superhero setting. So again, it was it definitely was a revolutionary take to check in on Bruce at this middle-aged, and his narrative is so heartfelt. But let me talk about the real star of the book. It's not Batman. Everyone talks about The Dark Knight Returns, this ultimate Batman story, and this has become even more apparent as this epic has unfurled across the decades, that what this story is really about to me is this character right here. So it's Carrie Kelly, who is introduced as the new Robin of this timeline. And increasingly, this Dark Knight epic has really centered on her and her experience, and how she carries the torch of what Bruce started and takes it to an entirely new level, and faces challenges that are way more complicated, intense than what he faced, beating up the Penguin or whatever. So for me, it's a Carrie story, and that's really dawned on me as I've revisited this book over the years. Dark Knight Returns and the Dark Knight Odyssey. So there's the Dark Knight Returns, which is actually 4 books, each with a different title. Collectively, that first 86 miniseries is called The Dark Knight or The Dark Knight Returns. Then there was they did a Dark Knight 2. I think that was around the turn of the century, meaning like early 2000s. I don't know the date off the top of my head. And it was it was a tough act to follow. One of the most influential comic books or piece of comic art ever made, right? To do the sequel for it, I think it's fantastic. It features crazy off the wall computerized coloring, and almost instantaneously, Miller widens the lens on this whole thing away from just Batman to the entire DCU. So in one of my earlier videos, the last video, I was talking the video I did about Rob Liefeld and X-Force. I made mention that Frank Miller is a nerd, and I mean that in a completely loving way. I mean that in a way to demystify this idea of grim and gritty. Read Dark Knight 2, and it's as grim as again, I don't know. I don't find it to be grim. I find it to be uplifting in that um, the artistry and the way that he channels things that are happening in the world around us and puts it. I mean, it's storytelling. It's incredibly powerful storytelling to me, and there are uncomfortable aspects of that, but I don't see the whole thing as like an endlessly bleak and grim outlook. Quite the contrary. If anything, the darkness and the perverseness of the evil that's portrayed makes the heroes rising above it that much more heroic, right? When they soar, you feel it. And I think that's the thing that's lost in a lot of these broad paint strokes of like Dark Knight Returns, gritty, made comic books gritty. To me, it didn't. It gave a new look, a new feel. I think that's a huge part of it too, is that the way that the Dark Knight Returns was produced in these like these really nice issues that were oversized, no advertisements, really good kind of deluxe format. Trade dressing is what they called it. And it was a totally different experience than picking up a comic book off the rack at 7-Eleven with staples in it and stuff. These were like square bound. And it was really the birth of the mainstream superhero graphic novel. Of course, Will Eisner created the graphic novel way before this, and folks have been doing amazing stuff in that medium. But in terms of your meat and potatoes superhero thing, this was a level of sophistication applied here. And concurrent to this in 86, so it's probably one of the biggest years in comic history. You've got Watchmen happening, doing very much the same thing. So you've got these adult takes happening on the superhero thing, quote unquote. But yeah, I mean, as I revisit Dark Knight, I don't just read the first part, the 86 part. I read the second part, and now there's even a third part, Dark Knight 3, The Master Race, that takes things even further. Miller's brought in a great scope of bringing in not just he's created a pocket universe in and of himself, for DC here, where the central ideas of Dark Knight Returns are now expanded out in a much, much bigger way. So the story gets a lot bigger. Again, I think it's more Carey centric. It's all about like the next generation, which again, to me, that's like a huge credit to Frank Miller, because this guy obviously could be resting on his laurels for what he did with Dark Knight Returns in 1986. Seismic shockwave, incredible success. And instead, he's like still plugging away at this thing, and he's making it about the next generation in a way that's like very modern and very cool. So the latest entry in this thing is a single issue called Dark Knight: The Golden Child, and he's tackling the offspring of our traditional heroes. So this is like the sons and daughters of Batman and Superman, and Wonder Woman, taking on new kinds of evil. There's a lot about our current level of misinformation and radicalization, and how people can be built up into a frothy anger and everything. And it's just it's brilliant. It's as much as Dark Knight Returns in 1986 captured the moment of like a long hot summer in American City, riddled with crime and a society that felt like it was careening out of control, which is very much what the late 20th century felt like. From that context, it was like, where is this going? Sort of the wobbly steps into an uncertain future. As we look back on it now, it wasn't quite that bad, but in the time, there was this sort of cauldron of energy there. And again, you see that reflected in the news, in the movies, in the film. Look at stuff like Death Wish, right? The Charles Bronson film series. You're going to see a lot of this type of stuff reflected, these sort of fears of not just the middle class, but I think just like these sort of common fear within the society of like what was happening. And a lot of it's the media too. If it bleeds, it reads, right? So you're getting served up the most gruesome, horrific murder stories. Old ladies getting pushed in front of subway trains and horrible stuff like this on a daily basis. And it's like it all adds up to this society out of control kind of feeling. That's very much captured in the first miniseries, Dark Knight Returns. As much as that's captured there, in Dark Knight 2, he's really capturing, Miller and team are capturing this sort of birth of the digital age that we were living through, this massive glut of information and information overload and hyper reality and where's everything going. And again, I read Dark Knight too, which I think is like, is it 10, 20 years old now, something like that. It's crazy. It feels modern still. It feels relative to like what we're living through every day in this new digital reality. Dark Knight 3: The Master Race, I would say that takes a more it takes a kind of a cerebral look at fundamentalism. So there's a take there on I think dogmatic beliefs, the ability of religion and belief and things to be bent and twisted to do horrible things. So he uses a sect of Kryptonians in there's things with the bottle city of Kandor and stuff. Again, reflecting, I think, what has happened over the last decade. You look at some of the different strife in the world and things. So yeah, I mean, when you talk about inspirations, I read Dark Knight Returns, and again, it's like, I remember picking it up for the first time. I don't think I really read it for the first time until probably the mid 90s. I was working in a comic book store, and it was just like, this is one of those classic stories you hear so much about. And I'm going to share my screen here. And, you hear so much about it, and you see this iconic image. I think this is one of the most iconic images in modern comics. And, I had seen this image. I had seen this image parodied a million times, referred to. I'd read tons of interviews with Frank Miller. I read a lot of his Sin City stuff and everything, but I hadn't read Dark Knight Returns. So I picked it up. And I was reading it as like a young teenager. And I think the first time I read it, I was just like, this. What's all the fuss about this? I was like, it was okay, but I found it to be, I guess because I went in so preloaded with the fact that this was a classic, I found it to be much more dense and, much more deliberate in pacing than what I expected. I'm not sure what I expected. I guess I thought it was going to be like complete madcap, and it's really not. It's a very measured and intricately constructed story. I mean, some of these pages that you hit on here are, some of the panel constructions. Like if I wrote this, you got like what, 16, if I hand an artist a script and I'm like, let's do 16 panels on a page, they're like, dude, you're killing me, so it's very condensed, it's very intricately constructed story. And as a young person reading this, it's like there's not a lot of Batman going crazy in this, and it's quite the opposite. So I read it the first time, and it didn't quite blow me away as this so-called classic. And then I came back to it, I think around the time Dark Knight 2 came out, and then just in those few years, I kind of got it a lot more. I think having read more and more comics, having read more European comics, you can definitely see Miller bringing a lot of the European aspects to this in terms of the look, the feel, the tone. The way this page is constructed, for example, reminds me of a British comic book more than your average American comic book. So you take a look at some of the stuff that was being done in the UK throughout the 80s. It's just like, I think Miller has probably spoken to it better than I can surmise here, but he obviously had some really unique influences that he brought into the mix here. And again, it's not all artifice. I think he's really a master storyteller, leveraging every tool he can to paint a picture here. Tremendous use of lighting. The lettering is phenomenal, and I think the coloring by I don't get the name right, Lynn Varley, obviously, is second to none, and really gave this story its super distinct look and feel. So I think the coloring here is not to be overlooked at all. Klaus Janson as well, the super legendary artist in his own right. He does the inks on Miller's work and really gives them a nice uh, weight and energy that I think they meld together so well here. And so just on the surface level, in terms of how this comic is put together and constructed and the story it tells, just a fantastic read. It's a very gripping type of thing. It's like it's like a movie that the reel kicks on and you're thrust into its world and there's no escape. It's almost a claustrophobic kind of story for me. You feel the heat of the city. You feel the the oppression of the characters' baggage on top of it. So again, look at the panel construction here is very condensed, and it gives you that it's an intense feeling. You're drawn into it here, and so again, there's all kinds of action and things going on here. Batman is older. He's not at the top of his game physically. Again, look at these panels. And again, as I think the first time I visited this as a kid, I'm just like, this makes Chris Claremont X-Men comics look like a breeze. This is so dense. But then as I revisited it later, I had become a huge fan of Miller's collaboration with Dave Gibbons, the Give Me Liberty series with Martha Washington. And so, a lot of the seeds from that were planted in this. So this kind of dense type of storytelling, I got more accustomed to it and started to love it. But yeah, you can see here, this is just an incredibly dense amount of information. You don't see a ton of comic pages like this anymore. But Miller is amazing in this. The characters, the detail, the dialogue. It's all great, to say the least. So why has this thing stood the test of time? I think, again, I think Miller brings so much to the table here and mixes it together in such a unique way that, it's really more than just a Batman story. It's really the explosion of what's possible with comic books. So I think that's part of it. I think the other thing is, again, with all these classics, I can't shake the sense that there's a subsection of folks out there who have taken the wrong things from it. I think there's people out there who are like, oh, it's a dark Batman story or whatever. And again, it's really not. I think especially when you hone into the story arc of Carrie, it's really one of the most hopeful and uplifting Batman stories. It reminds you why a story of a ridiculous millionaire who dresses up like a bat is something that's stood over generations now, because it's not just about those silly trappings. It's about something more. It's about these human stories that drive us to shine some light through the darkness. So yeah, I know the grim and gritty label is there, but in the process of this grim and gritty universe Frank Miller sets up, he delivers this ultimate ray of light in Carrie Kelly, who, as time has gone on, I think she's my favorite Robin. Honestly, there's no shortage of Robins to choose from, and that's a different video for a different time. It's probably a mistake on the part of DC to have 5 or 6 different boy wonder or sidekicks in the mix. It's a little silly at this point, but as time has gone on, I think the one that inspires me the most is Carrie. And when she flies, we're flying right alongside her, which is the intention of Robin, right? That's the vehicle of the character. It's for the reader to be, none of us are going to be Batman. None of us are cool enough to be Batman. Maybe my friend Jose Torres is cool enough to be Batman. Shout out Jose. But we can all be that person who wants to ride alongside Batman, right? And that's what Carrie is. So I think looking through this, to me, again, it's not a grim and gritty situation. It's an uplifting, heroic story, even more so as the series has evolved over time. So how does Dark Knight Returns and Frank Miller's take on DC's heroes? How does that impact me and what I'm doing in my work? Well, I mean, it's one of those things that's had such a seismic event in the industry. No matter what kind of comic you're doing, whether you're doing a black and white European melodrama, whether you're doing an adventure story, whether you're fashioning a autobiographical type of thing, the fact that there's a foundation of a direct market within the United States today. I'm not going to lay the entire weight of that on Dark Knight Returns, but it's a major keystone component of that, in my opinion. I think without it, I just don't imagine how the sort of modern comic book store that magically exists well into the 21st century. I don't know how it persisted beyond the 80s. You had your sort of standard superhero fare. I think New Teen Titans and Uncanny X-Men were like the hot books that were driving sales, but stuff like Dark Knight Returns would like make the evening news, you know what I mean? And have interviews with Frank Miller in popular culture magazines of the day. It really got comics out of the comic shop in a weird way, and then turned some eyes towards the comic shops and brought them in. So I think no matter what kind of work you're doing in comics, I don't want to say you owe a debt to Frank Miller, but it would be silly to discount the impact of it. Again, I think Dark Knight Returns probably gets a bad rap in some circles as being this like kind of, ultimate fanboy kind of thing. And I think if you read the work, it's still a pretty stunning piece of work, in my opinion. And it probably doesn't help that, Batman fights Superman. Oh, this is like, this is something, again, I think you take these elements out of the context of the story and you lose the meaning of it completely. I don't see this as a grim and gritty thing. There's another thing, Batman inspires this entire, section of a mutant gang to work for him. And I think that's another thing that Miller is making a statement here, is that like, don't write off the youth, the youth of the day and all of that stuff, that there's a, that given the right inspiration and the right, the right model, you can direct those forces to do good things. So there's a lot of that going on here. So I think, I don't know, Frank Miller's this dude from Vermont. Again, I say Frank Miller's a nerd, and it's inescapable. If you know anything about comic books and you read Frank Miller's comics, no matter how cool, like Sin City is like, oh, gangster, beautiful women and all this stuff, fast cars and everything, no matter how the cooler he tries to be, the more that these nerdy comic influences come out to somebody who has the eye to see it. And I think that's phenomenal, because it's really amazing that he's still expanding this story to this day. Again, 1986, it's like he like basically created one of the greatest comics of all time in 1986. He honestly, then he went on to do Sin City and all this other stuff. He doesn't need to do anything else, and he's still adding on to this thing, within the last couple of years or whatever. The Golden Child just came out like last year before. It's awesome. And he's still teaming with great artists, so he's somebody who's like obviously steeped in the comic book world, and that's why I say lovingly, Frank Miller is a nerd. You look at Dark Knight 2 and the way it really does a complete survey of the Silver Age cast of characters. So you've got every member of the Justice League or whatever, the top members, they're reflected in his Dark Knight 2 in a way that is just hinted at here. So I mean, pretty awesome. And again, to me, it doesn't really quite fit that cookie cutter grim and gritty label to me, because no one who's writing about the Atom or Green Lantern, or any of these like ridiculous Silver Age things can truly lay claim to being grim or gritty. Because at the end of the day, these are characters and stories born of the most gaudy kind of wide-eyed optimism possible. So what Miller does is he forces them through this entirely different meat grinder of the world we live in, but somehow shows that they can kind of come out of it, even if it's with some warts and all. So yeah, Dark Knight Returns. It's hard not to, if you're sitting down to do a somewhat action oriented comic book story like I'm trying to do with Lady Dark. It's definitely hard not to look at Miller as a source of inspiration, whether it's his characterization, his pacing, his artistry, his love of the art form and of the comics. All of that comes through in a way that, again, it far surpasses the surface level descriptions of this. If you haven't read Dark Knight Returns, give it a try. I really suggest that you read the entire thing. So Dark Knight Returns, Dark Knight 2, and the recent Dark Knight 3, as well as there's the Last Crusade one shot where it's Frank Miller and John Romita Jr. Telling a Batman Joker story, and then there's the Golden Child, which is Frank Miller writing and a Brazilian artist, I believe, by the name of Rafael Grandpa, I believe. And the artwork there is phenomenal. There's a new hardcover of that just came out like a few months ago, maybe a year ago or something. Super good. If you've read Dark Knight Returns in the past and it's been a while, I can heartily recommend this Absolute Dark Knight edition that DC has put out. It contains Dark Knight 1 and 2. It's an oversized hardcover experience, but I love it. It really brings Miller's artwork to life. This is sort of your like Criterion Collection version of it, and the coloring, the paper quality, and everything is like really fantastic. You see the color work on Dark Knight 2 super jumps out here on this. Again, it's a super oversized hardcover. It comes in a really nice slipcase, but to me, this is the Cadillac of Dark Knight Returns thing. And this is a book that I absolutely am pulling down off the shelf about once a year and reading through. I'm not the biggest Batman fan in the world. I'm not like a regular Batman reader. I've been checking out some of the recent issues. They have some phenomenal artists at work there. The gentleman's name is Jorge Jimenez, and he's bringing this like really awesome angular thing, but I'm not like mega steeped in the Batman world. But Dark Knight Returns is one that I return to and definitely enjoy checking out on an annual basis. So yeah, Batman Dark Knight Return, not as grim and gritty as you may think. So give it a read. And again, I think consistent theme here is the human heart that really powers the story. So whether it's Bruce Wayne or Jim Gordon or Carrie Kelly taking up the mantle of Robin, you're going to find a lot of humanity and heart within this so-called grim and gritty universe. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back again soon with another comic book inspiration to share with you all. Thanks. Bye.